and that's where I grew up initially, but then I got nearly all my education in Britain, and I did my doctorate in Oxford on the historian Procopius of Caesarea, and I've been teaching at the University of Ottawa now since 2001, and I also taught there for a year in the 1990s, so I'm very happy to be at the university and in a very pleasant department, and I think amongst the strengths obviously is the bilingual nature of the university, but also the facilities that it has for the research I do. It's got quite a long tradition in studying late Roman history, not just at the University of Ottawa, but also at Carleton University as well, and St Paul's. And my research is really to do with late antiquity, what this period of the fall of the Roman Empire is all about. And at the moment I'm interested actually in views on, well, whether how the fall of the Roman Empire came about, how important it is, how we should perceive it, that sort of thing. And I've just finished a year's sabbatical where I've been in Britain and in Germany. We're very fortunate in Ottawa that we've got our Museum of Greco-Roman Antiquities in our department, which kind of adds to the sort of the interest that you can handle objects from that time, and a whole range of things, just a small collection. But I think also in our politics, in our architecture, in so many things that we have that are derived in some way from the ancient world, that in a way I don't think we have to sell it too much. There's a lot of interest, actually, if you look at documentaries, films, Gladiator 2, and all of these things that are constantly coming out. I think Ottawa is about as good a place as any to study in. I think, well, I always enjoyed the Asterix books when I was a child. When I was growing up in Ottawa, I remember being given my first one in French, of course, and I thought that was fun. And then, of course, I got the chance when I was at school in England at a much earlier age than is normal in North America. So I was able to start Latin when I was, I don't know, 9 or so, and Greek probably when I was 10 or 11. So, and I just really liked what I was reading, and the fact that I could learn these other languages. And obviously the history, for many people it's the myths that they're interested in. I mean, the Greek myths, which, are so influential with our music, literature and everything like that, and Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. I did like that, but for me it was the history above all. Thucydides and Herodotus, the Greek historians who sort of founded the genre, and then how that evolved in the Roman period. And then somehow I found my way to late antiquity, and that was because I read an excellent novel I recommend wholeheartedly by Robert Graves. Many people will be familiar with him because he wrote I, Claudius, which was adapted for television. And he also wrote Count Belisarius, which is about a Roman general in the 6th century and how he reconquered large parts of what had been the Roman Empire, setting out from Constantinople. And I thought, wow, this is very exciting. And that's what I did my doctorate on. I think it's both the events themselves, so the events, the history and so on, but also the way in which they are recounted. One of the things that ancient historians always do, that is, like Herodotus, they always give you these great speeches before a battle. Perhaps one of the most famous of those is not so far from where we are now in Scotland. It's a very famous speech that Tacitus, the Roman historian, puts into the mouth of a Highland chieftain before a battle with the Roman army. And he says, he's scathing about the Roman Empire, and he says, solitudinem faciunt parcem appellant. They make a wilderness and they call it peace. And that's his indictment of the Roman Republic. But those words, Tacitus has no idea what he wrote. He never even went to Britain, probably. But to be so self-critical, to sort of be able to attribute these words and so on, and then recount the battle, it's fascinating stuff. Certainly, yes, Procopius is an author I've been working on for more than 30 years, and I did my doctorate on him. He's a 6th century AD historian. So he's writing about the time of the Emperor Justinian. And he clearly, a bit like what I was just saying a few minutes ago, he was accompanied Belisarius, this general, who not only was victorious against the Persians, who were the traditional enemies of the Romans in the east, but then accompanied the general on an expedition to North Africa, where he overthrew the Vandal kingdom and reconquered it for the Roman Empire, then went to Italy, where in a rather longer campaign, Belisarius succeeded in capturing Rome, withstanding a siege of 1 year when the Goths besieged him there, and finally retaking the whole of Italy. And he was amazed by these events, at what had been accomplished in his own day, and therefore set out to describe them. And as he says himself, he was very well placed to do this because he witnessed many of the events himself. So these are eyewitness accounts. But what's interesting is he got a bit fed up after that. He was depressed because Justinian kind of dropped the ball and gave less and less sort of fewer and fewer resources to Belisarius and his other generals. Along came a massive plague, the first instance of bubonic plague, the Justinianic pandemic. So that everything started to go wrong for the Romans, and he became thoroughly disillusioned, which meant that although he published these accounts of the wars, which were pretty upbeat, at least in the opening bits, he then published a kind of scathing criticism of Justinian and everything to do with him, and even Belisarius. And that's known today as the Secret History, or Anecdota. Never published in his lifetime. It's a miracle it survived, because it was just shoved away somewhere and resurfaced hundreds of years later. And then finally he wrote a book on the buildings of Justinian, the defences and the churches, which he's very interested in, clearly. And some people, that's supposed to be the opposite, sort of praising the regime and how good it is. But some people kind of think he's being ironic some of the time. Yes, exactly. No, and when I gave a lecture many years ago in New Zealand, somebody came up to me and gave me a suggestion that Procopius's life, his career, was a bit like there was a Soviet, a very high-ranking Soviet general, I think Dmitry Volkogonov was his name, who wrote a biography of Stalin. And although he'd risen to the top and was obviously a Communist Party member, he became very depressed at what he saw, what had happened in the Second World War, and was very critical of Stalin. And this was just in the sort of 80s, so things were loosening up a bit. He wanted to publish this. Nope, he got the shove, couldn't bring out his book. He did in the end, but I think he lost his status and everything. So in other words, a bit like Procopius, the more he researched, the more he looked at this, more disillusioned he got. And I think there are other parallels where people begin by being inspired as they start their account, and then, yeah, their hopes are shattered. Well, I suppose I've talked a lot about Procopius, but Belisarius, I have to say, perhaps because I read the novel, so in a way I'm influenced by how he's portrayed in a novel. But what always impresses me with Belisarius, I mean, there have been other Byzantine or East Roman generals who are much the same, is this ability, what they're famous for, is sort of bluffing, avoiding combat when you can, getting the results by deception. I mean, this sounds bad if some people like the Romans because they just beat everybody up. Well, if you can reach your goals by indirect means, so much the better, and you're shedding less blood and you're saving resources. And Belisarius was an absolute master of this. He could, and his ability to adapt to the most terrible circumstances. And I'll give you one example, which is when he was about 60, just towards the end of Justinian's reign, he was in retirement. And there was an invasion of a type of Huns which was getting dangerously near to Constantinople, the capital of the empire where he lived, and so did Justinian, and obviously a large number of people, but the defences were not in a very good state. So he was summoned to do something, and he went out with several thousand of his former soldiers, all of them pretty grizzled and grey, and he marched out from the walls and was able to confront the barbarians. He got a whole load of people behind to kick up a load of dust, made it look as if a massive army was approaching, and then with a handful of still competent soldiers inflicted a sort of minor defeat. But they gave up right away, thinking, oh my goodness, we're outnumbered, and off they went. Yes. I've been to Eastern Turkey and even to Syria. I mean, that was more than 20 years ago, so I was lucky enough to get to those places. Recently I was in Armenia and Georgia, where equally some of the events that Procopius describes take place. And apropos of translations of the work, with which I have been involved, I brought out an English translation based on the work of an earlier scholar, Averil Cameron, and that's published, and it's even out in paperback now for only £20, I believe. But I've been involved in a French translation as well, with commentary, and now there'll be one in Esperanto coming out soon. Well, Esperanto is, as some people may know, an international language spoken all over the world. And for instance, I've read the Quran in an Esperanto translation. The histories of Herodotus have been translated into Esperanto. So there is a certain public for translations into Esperanto. And this version that I've done, it's about as close to the Greek as I could keep it. But it'll also have diagrams, maps and so forth, like the other translations, and it'll have photos as well. So this will be the most user-friendly account of the Persian Wars. That's what that's that part, not the wars against the Vandals and the Goths. And because it's such an easy language, I rather think that, let's say, specialists in the field who teach maybe Latin and Greek and so on will realise that they're perfectly capable of understanding this translation and may find it useful. Exactly, it may not be a bigger audience, but it may well be a wider audience, so that countries such as Brazil or China, and indeed some African countries, because the World Esperanto Congress took place in Africa just a year ago. So there are, I think, there's a different reach, we could say, and it will be part of a series specifically to do with Orient or Occident, or sort of East-West thing, in which, for instance, there are various Chinese classics that have been translated, and all sorts of literature spanning between the Western and Eastern traditions, and this fits quite well into that. Should be out, I reckon, towards the end of this year, beginning of next year. Actually, there is one that just springs into my mind. It's as I get older, I appreciate more, which is the Athenian wise man Solon said, "Hierasco didaskomenos," which means I grow old while learning, which I think is a pretty good way to grow old. And he was renowned. Herodotus tells us all about him, a great lawmaker in Athens. And yes, in some ways, the democracy that evolved, is due at least partly to him. So there's so many things as I teach. I teach both Greek history, I teach Latin and Greek, and then I teach Roman history. And in all cases, whether it's the Persian Wars, for instance, or we've got a lot we can learn from the fall of the Roman Republic, the clash of egos, the polarization of society, and then a change from kind of democracy to the imperial system, which was a masked dictatorship, really. I mean, with the emperors, it did put an end to wars, but it was an autocracy with one person in charge, even if the sort of outward form of democracy or the consuls were still there, everyone knew the emperor was in charge. And some people do argue that in our society today that we are moving steadily in that direction. I would say two things. Yes, I think there's a tremendous amount to be learned from there, and that's why actually in China there's a tremendous interest in Greek philosophy, Greek political thinking. A conference a year ago to which Xi Jinping sent his he expressed his interest and his support for that, and there's now in political science what they call the Thucydides trap. So all of these things have their roots there and are tremendously important and useful for the whole way we conceive of politics, even the word politics. But I would go sort of challenge the premise almost. In other words, there are some things maybe in the ancient world, but also in pure mathematics or in all sorts of domains, which probably don't feed into the modern world, which are of no immediate relevance. And it's all too easy for them to be dismissed and got rid of in these tough times. And yet, they shouldn't be judged on such short-term criteria. If we're interested, then interest is still important. We want interested and sort of active, thoughtful citizens, and they should be allowed, even if it's whether it's Anglo-Saxon or Sanskrit grammar or something. All of these things have their place. Build it, sort of fit into the wider world, and some discoveries wouldn't be made if people weren't beavering away in very obscure areas, and suddenly they can, rather like the space program, there are all sorts of byproducts of the space program, nylon I think being one of them that nobody foresaw, but came out of it. And so we shouldn't be too narrow-minded on that. Well, we've had the big giveaway that I'm an Esperanto speaker, but perhaps the other one, which not everybody knows, is that I'm also a very keen wargamer. And let me make clear that this is not computer games. Oh no. These are proper...
Talking old school.
Exactly, old school. Nor are they miniatures. Nah, I've got no... I want cardboard counters, cards, and a nice big board, and... two-player games, but equally multiplayer games. They're all good.
Fantastic.